In one stunning swoop, the Cold War politics of the post-war era changed. America was recognizing and dealing with the communists.
Nixon was the great anti-communist, and to come on national television and announce that I've been invited to China and I've accepted with pleasure, it was astonishing. And you could tell by the reaction of the press.
White House aide Patrick Buchanan was on the trip the president called the week that changed the world.
We have at times in the past been enemies. We have great differences today.
He went to Beijing, frankly, because he was trying to work the foreign policy game to get the United States out of Vietnam with honor.
Nixon's aim was to have the Chinese pressure their North Vietnamese allies to come to terms at the peace table. And just 4 months after China, Richard Nixon became the first American president to visit Moscow, where he and Leonid Brezhnev signed the first Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. The president got something else as well.
He wanted Mao and Zhou Enlai in Beijing to have sleepless nights wondering what's Nixon talking to Brezhnev about over there in Moscow tonight. And he was a genius at this. And putting those tensions on, which had the effect of blocking Soviet or Chinese getting together to present a united front against the United States and Vietnam.
Nixon had taken a calculated chance, and it had worked. The Soviet Union cared more about getting controls on American offensive missiles and preventing the Americans from broadening and thickening an anti-ballistic missile system than they did about their little allies in North Vietnam, who were getting the living hell bombed out of them.
And there was a sense of being betrayed, sold off, at that time by the superpowers.
No longer able to depend on their powerful allies, the North Vietnamese appeared ready to make concessions at the peace talks. In October of 1972, there was an announcement from the National Security Advisor.
We believe that peace is at hand.
A month later, President Nixon, now seen as a seasoned world statesman, was re-elected. The crisis in Vietnam would soon be replaced by a new crisis at home. A growing scandal stemming from a break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters in the office complex known as Watergate. Hearings on Watergate dragged one White House aide after another in front of Congress to answer questions about systematic wrongdoing in the highest office in the land.
Watergate was certainly a fascinating spectacle. Suddenly, all the bad things the left had been saying throughout the Vietnam protests seemed to be proven true in spades.
Mr. Butterfield, will you stand?
The televised hearings drew in an enormous audience.
You swear the evidence that you shall give.
This was the first time the American people had ever heard that a president of the United States did things like that. But I guarantee you, he knew what the predecessors had done. It didn't all start with Watergate. There was ample precedent for everything that Nixon did. Nixon got caught.
There was one outrageous charge after another: break-ins, spying on anti-war activists, punishing political enemies.
In all of the millions of words of testimony, there is not the slightest suggestion that I had any knowledge of the planning for the Watergate break-in.
Congressional committees and their battery of lawyers were bringing the charges closer to the Oval Office. One of the president's lawyers at the time was Leonard Garment.
This was the show of the week, the month, the year, decade for young lawyers. Hello, young lawyers, wherever you are. And they were drawn by the excitement of the pursuit of the great white whale, all these Ahabs.
There was a constant pursuit by Congress and the press. It sometimes seemed the administration was coming unpinned. It looked that way in New Orleans when President Nixon shoved Press Secretary Ron Ziegler toward a horde of reporters.
And Nixon was trying every which way. How could he save his presidency? How could he pin it on somebody else? How could he rationalize what happened?
The Nixon White House was in, at least from the external and even from the journalist point of view, was in real shambles. They were paralyzed. I mean, they could do nothing but defend against Watergate.
And in the middle of all that, the country was subjected to further signs of collapse.
I will not resign if indicted. I will not resign if indicted.
In October of 1973, Vice President Agnew, the administration's top spokesman for law and order, did resign after he was charged with extortion, bribery, and tax evasion in a separate scandal all his own.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
But even as his allies were falling around him, the president was determined to finish his watch.
I welcome this kind of examination because people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
Imagine a president of the United States in a news conference on national television saying, I'm not a crook. You know, you never even before that ever conceived that a president might be a crook. It just all began to mount up, and ultimately it was a collapse.
Good evening. This is the 37th time I have spoken to you from this office, where so many decisions...
Finally, it was all too overwhelming, even for the toughest of battle-scarred politicians.
Each time. I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
You could never take the presidency quite as seriously again.